guys, today we're going to talk about the circulatory system, and Eloise wanted to join us, so she's going to stand back there like my bodyguard while I talk to you about blood flow and whatnot. Okay, so the function of the circulatory system, there are two functions. One is that it needs to deliver oxygen and nutrients to the individual cells in the body, and the other is that it needs to take waste products away from the individual cells in the body. So we have to get oxygen and nutrients in, and we've got to get waste products out. So the main parts of the circulatory system are going to be the heart, blood vessels, and then there are three types of blood vessels: arteries, capillaries, and veins. And then there's also the blood. So we don't really, remember we talked about how blood is a tissue? We don't really think about it as being a structure, but it is one of the main parts of the circulatory system. So again, heart, blood vessels, blood. All right, so the heart is made up of a muscle called myocardium. Myo means muscle. Cardium, we already know, means heart. So myocardium is heart muscle. It's enclosed in the pericardium, and the pericardium goes around the heart. That's what para means. Para means around. So it goes around the heart. It's like a Ziploc baggie holding the heart in. Fun fact, my uncle actually several years ago had something called pericarditis. Anytime you hear itis, that means like owie of the. So he had an infection in his pericardium, and it meant that his pericardium got really hard, kind of like an eggshell around his heart. And so what they did was they went in and they cracked off the top of it like a soft-boiled egg and pulled the top of it off. And then that meant that when his heartbeat could beat up and down instead of down. We lost Eloise. I guess we were just too boring. The heart is divided in the middle by the septum. So this is the septum right here. You also have a septum in your nose. It's a dividing structure inside of a cavity. Your heart pumps about 72 times per minute. And 72 times per minute is, of course, an average. It's going to depend on how old you are, how fit you are, the different genetics of your life, and stuff like that. Oh, my bodyguard is back. All right, the upper chambers of the heart are called the atria. If you've ever been in a fancy hotel where you walk in and there's a really big welcoming area, usually it goes up a couple floors, there's a fountain sometimes and skylights, it's that welcoming area. That's called the atrium of the hotel. So the atria of your heart are the welcoming areas. They welcome the blood into the heart. The lower chambers are called the ventricles. And if you look at the ventricles in this image, the ventricles are super duper muscly. That's where all your muscle is in your heart. And that's because what the ventricles do is they squeeze the blood out. So again, the atria just receive the blood and the ventricles squeeze the blood out. Your heart has valves in it that keep the blood from moving backwards. So they go one way. So it's like if you've ever been to the subway and there are those weird turnstiles that you can go through where you can only go one way to get out of the subway. You can go one way, but you can't go the other way. That's how valves work. They only go one direction. And then you also have something called the pacemaker. And the pacemaker is sort of the colloquial term, but there's also a more scientific name for it, and it's the sinoatrial node, or the SA node. And that's written right here. The sinoatrial node. And so that's sort of has the electronic control over your heart. It sends the electronic signal that says, hey, it's time to beat. And the pacemaker starts off each set of contractions for you. So what happens with a contraction? So the blood comes into the atrium, and then the pacemaker is going to tell you that it's time for the atria to squeeze. And so the atria are going to squeeze blood past a valve and into a ventricle. And then another electrical impulse is going to get to the ventricles, and the ventricles are going to squeeze the blood out of the heart, or it's either going to go to the lungs or the body, depending on which side of the heart it's coming from. By the way, I bent over to pick up Charlie because he wanted to say hi. He was lonely. He was being left out. All right, so the blood vessels. You have arteries. Arteries carry blood away from the heart. Arteries away, arteries away. Arteries carry blood away from the heart. Arteries are really muscular, and they have the thickest walls because they're the place that gets the big push of blood out of the heart. So if you take a look at this artery over here, you can see that there is this really strong muscle inside of here. There is also stuff you know about now, the connective tissue on the outside, and something called endothelium on the inside, which is basically just a different way of talking about epithelium. The arteries usually carry oxygenated blood, and there is one exception to that we will get to later. Arteries branch off, and they get narrower and narrower as they get more numerous. I would like to show you there's instant art going on. I had a picture drawn of me as I was doing this. This is some pretty fancy art.
I have to tell you something. That one blood set that's red looks like ketchup squeezers.
Yeah, she likes the artery. The artery looks like a ketchup bottle. All right, so the arteries branch off. They get narrower and narrower and narrower, and eventually they get so narrow that they're these things we call capillaries. Oops. Capillaries are so narrow that they are only one cell wide. So when cells want to go through capillaries, they have to go through one at a time. They go through single file. And capillaries are the place where all the action's at. Capillary is the location where oxygen leaves the blood and carbon dioxide enters the blood. So all those oxygenated blood cells drop off oxygen. All of those now newly deoxygenated blood cells pick up carbon dioxide. They'll also pick up wastes, and they'll drop off nutrients. Okay, so if you think about, remember the capillaries, the place we talked about capillaries before was in the alveoli of the lungs, where you had the alveoli and then the capillaries laid on top of them, and that was how oxygen got into the blood and carbon dioxide left the blood. That's the only place that happens. Everywhere else, oxygen is leaving, we're dropping off oxygen to the rest of the cells, carbon dioxide is coming back in. The capillaries then do the opposite of what the veins did, or what the arteries did before. They come together into veins. And then the veins carry blood to the heart. So just like we said, arteries away. If you're a French or a Spanish speaker, venir means to come. So if you're going to come home, tu viens à la maison, you come home, venir. So veins bring blood back to the heart. Veins generally carry deoxygenated blood. Again, there's an exception to that rule that we'll talk about in a little bit. Veins have much thinner walls because they don't have as much pressure, because the heart pushes the blood that goes out to the arteries. But then the blood just kind of coasts around to get back through the veins and back up to the heart. Now, there are, of course, muscles in all of your blood cells or blood vessels, but they're not really doing the same thing that the heart is doing. The heart is giving the gigantic push, and the arteries get the thrust of that push. The veins just sort of get the blood coasting back. Veins also have valves, just like the heart does, to keep blood from flowing backward, because of course they're not getting that big push. It's the blood sort of coasting, so it's more likely, especially in veins in like your legs, where we have to go against gravity with the blood, that the blood could kind of seep back down again. And in fact, that's what varicose veins are. Varicose veins are when the valves in the veins get a little floppy and blood kind of pools back. Now, I can tell you from personal experience, there are definitely valves in your veins, because I participated in a study, and they drew blood from me every 5 minutes for 6 hours. And they had to do what's called a reverse blood draw. So that means it goes backwards against the normal flow of a vein. So they put the IV in my hand. It was right here in my hand. And then every 5 minutes, they pulled some blood out, and they pulled it backwards. And so the blood went against the vein, or against the valve. And so the valve would vibrate whenever they would pull the blood. It felt like having a cell phone inside my hand. That's the best way I can describe it. And they told me, oh, it'll stop. Your hand will get habituated to it. You'll stop feeling it. They were wrong. Every 5 minutes for 6 hours, I felt that little vibration in my hand. It was the creepiest thing. All right, so blood. So blood plasma. Plasma is the solution that makes up most of the blood, just like cytoplasm makes up most of a cell. So plasma is the solution that makes up most of the blood, and it's made up mostly of water and then just dissolved nutrients and minerals. Eloise says this looks like someone sneezed and the blood came flying out of their blood vessel. Red blood cells are the donut-shaped cells that carry oxygen and carbon dioxide, and they have no nuclei. So if red blood cells don't have nuclei, what else does that mean they don't have? Good, that means they don't have DNA. Okay, white blood cells are the cells that help with immunity. They're the ones that keep you safe. There are different kinds of white blood cells that fight off infection in a bunch of different ways. We're not going to worry about that right now. We'll worry about that when we get to our unit on immunity. Okay, so the big deal here, circulation. How does blood move through the body? So the first thing you need to remember is that you have what's called a closed circulatory system. So blood moves through the body on a loop. There's no official start. There's no official end. You could pick this up anywhere you want and follow the path until you get back to where you started. I always like to start in the right atrium. I don't know why. It's where I decided to start. It just is what it is. Also, a disclaimer about this clip art that I picked. It's actually animated clip art, so there's like little blood cells flowing through it. And I don't know if you're ever going to see it go through a full path or if I'm going to click through and the timing's not going to be right. So just try to ignore those dots if you can. Okay, so we're going to start in the right atrium. And deoxygenated blood is going to come into the right atrium. So this has low oxygen, high carbon dioxide. The right atrium is going to contract. So remember, the SA node is going to send us the electrical impulse. It's going to contract, and blood is going to push past this thing called the tricuspid valve. Now, this is not a very good drawing of the tricuspid valve because it should look like it has 3 parts. That's why it's called the tricuspid valve. But blood is going to push past the tricuspid valve into the right ventricle. Now remember, a second impulse is going to come to the right ventricle, and the right ventricle is going to contract, and it's going to push blood out past this valve called the pulmonary valve. And the pulmonary valve is a really good name for it because what it leads to is the pulmonary arteries. So you have this one pulmonary trunk, or pulmonary arch, sometimes you'll see it's called, that then branches out into 2 pulmonary arteries. Anytime you see the word pulmonary or pulmono, that refers to lungs. So a pulmonologist is somebody who is a doctor for your lungs. So if you have lung problems, you'll go to a pulmonologist who will help you out. Okay, so the blood goes to the pulmonary arteries, and then those are going to take the blood to the lungs. Now, remember, I said generally arteries carry oxygenated blood. This is the one exception, pulmonary arteries. Pulmonary arteries are carrying deoxygenated blood because they are going away from the heart, arteries away. That rule always applies. Artery away, always applies. Artery away from the heart. But this is the pulmonary artery, so it's going away from the heart and to the lungs. So away from the heart to the lungs means we're taking deoxygenated blood to the lungs so that it can get filled back up with oxygen. So from the pulmonary arteries, then the blood is going to go to the lungs. And in the lungs, the blood is going to pick up oxygen and drop off carbon dioxide. And again, the capillaries are going to meet up with what in order to make that happen? Alveoli. Good. And remember, the capillaries don't go inside the alveoli. The capillaries just sit on top of the alveoli, and there's diffusion through the alveolar walls and the capillary walls. So the blood is going to pick up oxygen and drop off carbon dioxide. So now our blood is oxygenated. So blood is going to go back to the heart through the pulmonary veins. Again, I told you before that veins typically carry blood that's deoxygenated. This is the exception. The pulmonary veins are the exception. They carry blood that's oxygenated, again, because it's coming back from the lungs. The pulmonary veins are going to send blood into the left atrium. So here are our pulmonary veins coming from this side. Here are our pulmonary veins coming from this side. They're going to send blood into the left atrium. From there, the left atrium is going to contract, send blood past the mitral valve and into the left ventricle. Okay, now there's one place our blood hasn't been yet, and that's where it's going to go now. So the left ventricle is going to squeeze the blood out past the aortic valve, through the aorta, so it's going to go up past underneath the pulmonary arch, through the aorta, out to a bunch of different locations where finally, the blood is going to go from the aorta to smaller arteries and eventually to capillaries in the body. So now our body cells, all the rest of our body cells and our fingers and toes and all the rest of our parts, oxygen is going to get dropped off to those cells and carbon dioxide is going to get picked up. Now we have deoxygenated blood again. That deoxygenated blood is going to go from the capillaries, come back together into veins, which are going to come back together into bigger veins. And they're going to come into these 2 main veins called the inferior and superior vena cava. I'm going to run out of battery power, so I better finish this fast. So the inferior and superior vena cavas are going to bring blood back to the heart. You should be able to guess where they're going to bring blood back to the heart. We have deoxygenated blood coming into the heart. Where's it going to go? Hopefully you said the right atrium. And then the party starts all over again. I know that's overwhelming and it's crazy, but you have to know it. You've got to know that path of blood. You should be able to pick up a blood cell from anywhere in the heart or anywhere in the body and trace its path all the way back to where it came from. All right, so we really did lose power, but we're back again now. Okay, so blood pressure. Blood pressure is the force of blood pushing on the arterial walls. It's literally the pressure created by blood. And it's measured in arteries because that's where the heart is pushing blood the hardest. A normal blood pressure is generally around 120/80. Again, that's another thing that's going to change depending on how old you are, how fit you are, what your genetics are, various things about you. So what do those two numbers mean? The 120 is systole, and systole is the pressure on arterial walls when the heart pushes blood out. So when the heart is contracting, and that blood gets pushed out and it gets pushed really hard to the arteries, it's pushing up against the arterial walls the strongest, that's a measurement of how strong that blood is pushing on the arterial walls. But of course, the next thing that happens is that your heart is going to relax. Your heart muscle relaxes. Well, when your heart muscle relaxes, the blood is still pushing on the arterial walls, just not as hard. And so that second measure, the diastole, is the pressure of the blood on the arterial walls when your heart is relaxed. So contract systole, relax diastole. Contract systole, relax diastole. Okay, so some problems that you can have in your circulatory system. One of them is called atherosclerosis. And atherosclerosis is when you get fatty deposits that build up on the inner walls of the blood vessels. And again, that just comes from a fatty diet, from not eating a balanced set of fats. You've probably heard about HDLs and LDLs and cholesterol and all of those different things. And it's all comes down to your diet and whether you're keeping things balanced. So when you get fatty deposits, or sometimes we call them plaques, that build up on the inner walls of your blood vessels, that's atherosclerosis. Now, this is a nice sort of sanitized diagram. I'm going to show you a real picture. Ugh. That's what a lifetime full of Big Macs 3 times a day will get you. So, again, keep your diet relatively healthy and balanced. You're going to be good to go. You're not going to have this building up in your blood vessels. But if you take a look at just how narrow this is in terms of blood could be flowing past here, could be flowing through all of this space, but in fact it's only flowing through this space because of the buildup. Ew, gross. Okay, so some other problems. Hypertension. Hypertension is exactly what it sounds like. Hyper meaning high, too much. Tension, pressure, high blood pressure. So hypertension is just a fancy word for high blood pressure. Of course, the harder your heart has to work, your heart is a muscle. What happens when you work a muscle? You work a muscle over and over and over again, it gets bigger and bigger and bigger. Well, your heart works the same way. It's a muscle. If you work your heart too hard, the muscle is going to get bigger and bigger and bigger. Well, the problem is that you have a confined space. So if the muscle is going to get bigger, then it's going to move into the space that should be where blood gets held. And so what happens with something called a congestive heart, which can ultimately lead to congestive heart failure, meaning your heart dies because you have too much muscle in there, it can't do what it needs to do. This space in your ventricles is super small. So you can't get enough blood in there, which means you can't pump enough blood out to the rest of your body. And then that means the rest of your cells aren't going to have enough oxygen, aren't going to be able to get rid of carbon dioxide. Bada bing, bada boom, no more you. Okay, if the heart muscles themselves can't get enough oxygen, so there are things called coronary arteries. And coronary arteries are arteries that take blood to the heart muscle itself, because those are cells too. Those cells need to get oxygen and need to have carbon dioxide taken away. So if you can't get oxygen to parts of your heart, those heart cells will die. That's what happens when you have a heart attack. That's why you can live through a heart attack, because you can just have a small set of cells that die off as opposed to a big set of cells that die off in a massive heart attack. If you have a massive heart attack, probably you're not going to make it. If blood flow to your brain is cut off and the brain doesn't get enough oxygen, then that's what we're talking about when we say that you have a stroke. So that's blood not getting to a specific place in your brain, and then parts of your brain cells or parts of your brain are dying off. Brain cells are going, and we know that nerves don't regenerate that fast, and so you're going to have a problem there. All right, that's it. That's all I got for you, with the exception of this one joke that Eloise is going to read to you.
2 blood cells met and fell in love, but alas, it was all in vain.
Oh, those poor blood cells. All right, that's all we have for you. See you in the next video.